Hi, my name is Rob and I'm a volunteer here at Bushy Run. Today what we'd like to do is have a discussion about the Three Sisters. The Three Sisters were a way that the Native Americans grew their three main crops that they would throughout the season in preparation for the long winter months when food became relatively scarce. We get most of our information about the Three Sisters from the Iroquois tribe, and they found a very unique way of taking these three vegetables and putting them and understanding the symbiotic relationship that they have. Now that's the word for today, symbiotic, S-Y-M-B-I-O-T-I-C. Now what that means is how things work together to help each other. And you'll see as we go on through the discussion how corn, beans, and squash form a symbiotic relationship that the Native Americans were able to capitalize on. Today, another word for symbiotic in relation to growing things or gardening would be companion planting. And each one of those three, corn, beans, and squash, all work together for one purpose in making it very beneficial to each other. Let me write down what they are so we don't forget. We have corn, beans, and squash. Sorry for the writing, but it gives you something to remember. Generally, let's talk about how they would do this. Of course, now you remember the Native Americans did not have tractors and things like that, so they didn't plow huge fields. What they would be near their village, they would come across pieces of ground that were able to be cultivated. It may be near a dead tree, or periodically there would be fires and things that would clear the brush and the undergrowth so that they would have the opportunity to do some vegetable cultivating. And basically what they were these mounds. If this is our ground, they would take the ground and pour it into a mound so that it raised about a foot, foot and a half off of the ground in the surrounding area. Now we'll look at it from a bird's eye view here so we describe how that mound looks. First thing they would do is they would take corn, and it's not the kind of corn that you would normally eat. It's not the sweet corn of today. It was the dried corn, the flint corns that they would grow and use, not eating sweet corn like you do, but they would grind it up into flour, which then they would make their breads and things like that. So what they would do at first, after they made their mound, they would plant their corn. And generally speaking, these mounds were about 3 feet across, but they could be larger, they could be smaller, based upon what they found out in the woods or in the fields. And in each one of these mounds, they would plant about 6 kernels of corn in this mound. And what they would do then, in about 2 weeks, this corn would start to sprout. And again, I'm not an artist, but at least it gives you an idea as to what would happen. So the corn sprouts, and what they would do would be in each one of these mounds, they would thin it to the 3 or 4 corn plants that were the strongest. And what that did was basically every year they would be picking the strongest corn plant so that in subsequent years they would save the seeds and so on. So once the corn was planted and was up about 4 to 6 inches tall, they would come along, and we're going to use blue for beans, and around each corn plant, now we've thinned them out to 3, around each corn plant we would plant 4 beans. Now these aren't bush beans, these are pole beans. These beans would send up stalks that would grow right up the side of the corn. Corn would grow about 5, 6, 7 feet tall, and the beans would just be growing right up the side of the corn. When the beans were planted, what we would do at that point, and we'll use yellow or orange for the squash, they would then, around the perimeter of their plot here, they would plant 3 or 4 squash seeds. Now when I say squash, it could be any type of squash. A lot of people would use pumpkins, which is what I use in my garden. I use the small sugar pumpkins. And because pumpkins are a squash, it's just a matter of just what variety they are. But what would happen here, and let me talk to you about the symbiotic relationship. The corn grows, and as we had planted our beans, the beans would then grow up the corn, which the corn is now providing the trellis for the beans to grow up. And what's the interesting part about the beans is in the roots of the beans take nitrogen from the air and put it back into the ground, which is the primary food, or a very large portion of the food, of a corn plant. So for the corn allowing the bean to grow up the corn, the bean in effect feeds the corn. So we've got the companionship between the corn and the beans. Now with the squash, we have the squash running around, and squash, if you've ever grown it, can go very, very long, long vines. So what the squash does is it covers the ground where the corn and the beans are, which keeps the ground a little shaded and a little cool, prevents weeds, and then when it does rain, it helps hold the moisture in so that the corn and the beans can utilize the moisture from the rains. Also, there are some people that believe that the pumpkin or the squash, if you've ever grown those, the vines are very thorny, which helps keep out the raccoons, because the raccoons' paws are very, very soft. And when they try to go into this circular planting, they oftentimes step on the vines of the pumpkins, and it hurts their feet. So it helps the squash, helps keep the rodents out and the ground cool, and so on. So that's what the three sisters are: corn, and it's a flower corn. It's not a sweet yellow corn like you're used to. Beans, they're always pole beans. And then, of course, squash. Squash can be your pumpkins, and preferably something that will crawl on the ground, as opposed to like zucchini, who stays in a very large plant. Now, what the Native Americans would do would let these grow and grow to maturity, and allow the plants and the corn to dry on the cob. They would pick the beans. They could the beans would dry on the vines, and they could shell them and save the dried beans for winter, and then the pumpkins they could dehydrate and do that as well, and have that vegetable for winter. So what we'd like to do is, and of course this is just a surface discussion about the basic principles of the Three Sisters, but what I'd like you to do is to do some more research on some other plants that the Native Americans may have and definitely did use for their sustenance. Here at Bushy Run, we wanted to do some demonstration gardens this year, but because of some of the things that occurred with the health and things like that, we've had to postpone it for this year. But there are about a half a dozen different types of demonstration gardens we would like to do. One of them would be a Three Sisters demonstration garden: corn, beans, and squash. Another one would be a garden where we would grow flax. And flax is a plant that, when it's harvested, it is combed out and it forms linen. It forms threads so that you can weave into cloth. Another one is a dyer's demonstration garden, where there are plants that you can grow that, when you process them, and it's a very simple process. For example, indigo, it's a green plant, but when you mix it with hot water, it turns a brilliant, beautiful blue. So if you have linen that you want to dye or wool that you want to dye. There's some interest in a dyer's garden. Also, there's two plants that you probably see if you have a garden. One is called lamb's quarters, which is very edible. It's highly nutritious, probably more nutritious than spinach. And it also gives off seeds, which the Native Americans would use to grind and to make flour for breads and things like that. Also, there's a erect knotweed. So you can do the research on an erect knotweed, and I'm sure when you see it online, you will know exactly what it is. It's something that, if you garden, you pull out quite frequently. Another one is dogbane, and dogbane is a plant that looks very similar to milkweed, but the Native Americans used to process it and be able to make string and rope. So these are the kind of things that at Bushy Run, if you are interested in, you can join us and volunteer and participate in these types of demonstration gardens and have the opportunity to learn right with us. So if you have the chance, watch the website and we'll let you know when we're going to start doing the planning, and you are more than welcome to come join us. Thank you.